Hello, I'm Tom Stephan with Goulds Water Technology, and today we're going to be replacing the seal on an NPE. Some documentation that you will need, which is available on Goulds.com, is the repair parts manual as well as the instruction manual. So the first step is really the proper PPE, and we're going to be wearing cut-resistant gloves and safety goggles. There's a lot of sharp edges, especially on a product like this, the NPE, so the cut resistance gloves are very important. So the first step, if we look at that instruction manual, is we're going to remove every one of these casing bolts. And so we're just going to make it easy on ourselves here and take each one of these out. So from this point, we're just going to remove this casing. Now, granted, this has been taken apart before, so it might require a rubber mallet just to knock this casing off. So one thing that we can see in the casing is the guide vane, and also there is a square O-ring inside here. So our next step is to remove the impeller nut. So this particular model has this lock nut. So we're going to have to remove that. And if it's been in service for a while, and also because there is some Loctite used for this model, an impact wrench is probably your best tool to remove that nut. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to get to the back of the motor to hold that shaft. So here's the back of the motor. There's a dust cover on here. So we need to remove this dust cover off. It's just pressed in, and that allows access to the back of that shaft, which has a flat spot on it so we can hold that shaft. So we're going to use some sort of tool like a screwdriver. If you need to remove it with 2 screwdrivers, that might be easier. So now that we've got the dust cover off, we can see the exposed back of the shaft that has a flat spot on there. So we need to hold that. So there's a couple options here. One is a 7/16 inch open end wrench. The other is maybe some vice grips. So we're going to grab onto that. So we're just going to secure that back so we can hold that shaft. So now we can begin to take the lock nut off and the impeller, which is also threaded in. At this point, because there's Loctite here, an impact wrench is a great tool for that. If not, we're looking at a 11/16, and this is right-handed threads, so we're just going to remove that. Now, granted, this has been taken apart, so it's going to be a little bit tougher than that. That's why an impact wrench is a great tool for that. So standard right-hand threads. So when we take that out, we can see some evidence of Loctite, right? So we're just going to put that in our handy cup so we don't lose all the parts. And again, this is threaded on, so we're going to continue to hold that back of the shaft and right-handed threads again, and we're going to unthread that impeller. And again, it's going to be a little more difficult, so perhaps a strap wrench, right, to help you remove that impeller. So we're just going to unthread that impeller. So behind that impeller is a mechanical seal with a spring. right? So I'm going to try to hold that to show you the order of everything here. A lot of threads. So we've got that impeller off. Again, we can see evidence of Loctite on that. So now we've got a spring and a bit of a washer here. So I'm just going to hold that so I can put that back in the correct order. So now we have access to the mechanical seal, and this is the rotating portion of the mechanical seal, the portion that rotates with the shaft. So we need to remove that. Now typically what we see there is with 2 screwdrivers, right, gently prying and pushing that mechanical seal off of the shaft. So if we damage, which we probably will damage the seal, it's okay because we're going to put a new seal in there. So we're going to set that aside. We do have a new seal handy. And next is the seal housing. And we can see here that the seal housing has the stationary portion of the mechanical seal pressed in. Also notice where the O-ring goes. So really the first step now would be to remove this stationary mechanical seal. And probably the best way to do that is if you find yourself a socket that just happens to fit in there, and we're going to hit that with a hammer, right? And we're just going to pop that out, right? Or you can use your hand. So we're going to pop that stationary portion of the mechanical seal out. And that is the disassembly. So now we're going to begin the process of reassembly. So we're going to start with the seal housing, and we're going to press the stationary component of the mechanical seal into the seal housing. Some other items that we're going to need is some version of assembly lube. We typically use P80, and that's going to help seat our mechanical seals and install our mechanical seals. And it's also a good idea to have some alcohol pads. And so once we're done installing both the stationary and the rotary portion of the mechanical seals, we're going to wipe the faces with an alcohol pad. So we're going to be using a 10K18, just a standard mechanical seal. And so we can see the packaging here. We got some bubble wrap. It's also wrapped up in paper. So we have a note here which talks about what form of assembly lube you can use. Again, we talked about P80. Here it talks about propylene glycol, glycerin, distilled water. So that's what that note is all about. So we're going to open up this mechanical seal. Again, we got our stationary component, and so we want to save that. So this little piece here comes in handy, and then this is the rotary face here with a new spring. So we're just going to set this over here, and we're going to focus on the stationary component. So it is wrapped up here. So we do want to, try to avoid touching the face. Sometimes it's difficult, but we are going to wipe that once we're done. So this is where we need some sort of assembly lube. Again, we're going to use P80, and just 1 or 2 drops is really all we need. Right? So we're going to install that stationary, and this is where we're going to use this piece that came in between. So we're going to use that, and we're going to press that in evenly. So we're going to press it down, and we're going to inspect it. So we want to make sure, we look from the back side here, we want to make sure that that's evenly pressed in. So we're just going to double check here, put some pressure on it, and we're going to press that in. All right, so you know, we can see some fingerprints or glove prints in there. So what we want to do is we just want to wipe that face clean. And it's probably easier to do it at this stage here. So we're going to wipe that face. And this will evaporate here, all of the liquid that you see. So we've got that face clean. So now we have the stationary component of the mechanical seal installed, and we double check to make sure that it is fully seated in the seal housing. Let's do a quick inspection on our O-ring. So probably easier, you know, this step is probably easier without gloves, but you want to just run that through your fingers and see that there's no cuts or nicks in that O-ring. So we can either put the O-ring on now, or we can put it on after we install the seal housing. So one thing about the O-ring is it kind of wants to twist a little bit. So let's just make sure that there's no twist in it and that it's on there properly. All right, so now we want to just slide our seal housing with mechanical seal onto the shaft. So this is one area where, you know, if we just slap it on there, if we do it in a hurry, we could do some damage to that mechanical seal because it is somewhat brittle. So we're just going to take our time and carefully place that on the shaft. So our next step is the rotating element of the mechanical seal. So we do want to put a little bit of P80 on the shaft. And again, 1 or 2 drops is typically all you need for that. So now we're going to take our mechanical seal, make sure that's fully seated against the stationary element of that seal. Okay, our next step is, remember the orientation of this piece right here. So this spring goes on, and you kind of have to hold that a little bit. And so we're going to put our impeller back on. So that, again, needs to be threaded. So we want to make sure that we're still holding that shaft. So we're going to thread that impeller on. So there is a specific torque value of the impeller and the nut. It's a bit of a challenge if you don't have the special tool, you know, the torque tool for that, for an impeller. So in this case, we are just going to, you know, snug that up as much as we can, right, by hand. Now the next step is to install the lock nut. So again, remember when we disassembled these, they did have some Loctite. So we would probably want to put some Loctite, probably 1 drop is what the work instructions say, on the threads for the impeller and for the nut. So we're going to find our nut here in our bin. And so we're still holding that shaft. So now we want to put the lock nut back on. So we're going to snug that lock nut on. Again, there is a torque spec in the manual if you're using a torque wrench. So now we've got an impeller threaded on. We've got our lock nut. Again, not a bad idea to use 1 drop of Loctite each for the impeller and the lock nut. And next, our final step is just putting the casing back on with the casing bolts. So before we do that though, we could take a quick look. We probably want to inspect that O-ring. So there is a square O-ring in here, and your guide vane just simply pops out. So we're just going to take that out and take a look. So here is your guide vane. So we'll give that a visual inspection. That looks okay. And notice the placement of that square O-ring. So we definitely want to inspect this and make sure that it is not pinched, because it is fairly easy to pinch this O-ring, especially if you or if someone else has already disassembled this product. So we're going to give that a quick visual inspection. That looks good. And so we want to place that. There's a bit of a groove there. So we want to place that. It's probably best to do this in this orientation and somewhat carefully put our guide vane in, because that O-ring, as we can see, still, floats around a little bit. So this is probably one of the trickiest steps here. We want to make sure that when we put this casing back on, this O-ring does not get pinched. Because that square O-ring is able to move in there, probably the best way to install this casing is in the vertical position. So that's what we're going to do here. So, and the most important thing is, so that O-ring does not get pinched and cut by the impeller. So we're going to flip this over, and after we do that, we can recenter that square O-ring. So we're going to recenter that, and then carefully look down there and make sure it's not pinched. So we can tell there's really no resistance, and I can visually see that it is not pinched and it didn't move. So from that point, we're just going to line up our holes, and we're going to put our casing bolts back in. And generally what you want to do there is the star pattern, right? So we're going to go here and then opposite, here and the opposite. So we're going to do that star pattern. And again, there is a torque spec in the manual. Okay, so now we're just going to tighten these down. These happen to be 5mm hex. Again, we're going to use the star pattern. Tighten these down. And one final thing, remember to put your dust cover back on. So in this case here, we've got the dust cover. We're just going to pop that back on and gently tap that in with a plastic or rubber hammer. So as a final step, we're going to make sure that that impeller spins freely. And so the other thing is we do see a rotation arrow here. Sometimes the easiest way to do that is making sure you have a glove on your hand. Just reach in there and spin that impeller. Make sure it spins freely and it's not catching on anything, or it's not completely locked up. So that feels good. There's normal resistance there, and that's how we change the mechanical seal on an NPE. Thanks for watching our video today. For additional information, go to Goulds.com.